During this lecture, I want to show you again a somewhat new feature of Xamarin Forms. This one is available since Xamarin Forms 3.0, but is still something that is not that widely used. And that is the use of style sheets. That's right, you can now use CSS to define the style of your XAML elements. And I believe this is especially interesting for those of you who have experience with web development or that come from web development. For those of you who are super familiar with XAML already, maybe you want to remain using or defining your styles with XAML, you can definitely still do that. But for those of you who have more experience with CSS, maybe this is something that you may want to do before defining the styles with XAML. So what I will do for this lecture is, in the Expenses app, so we are on the Expenses app, we are going to be changing a bit the style that we find inside of our categories page. I am going to add first and foremost a new folder that is going to be my style sheets. And inside of this folder, of course, I will have to add a brand new file. Now here on Visual Studio for Mac, we're going to find the web option. We can select empty CSS file, and I simply will call this styles. And we will create a brand new CSS file. Let me actually just move these things out a bit so I can show you the style sheet, the XAML page, and the preview at the same time. Now, the first thing that you have to do and that you should never forget when you create your style sheet is that you have to change is build action. The build action absolutely has to be embedded resource. Now, it may be the default value for build action that is set when you create the CSS file, but it may not. So you have to double check this. And if it's already embedded resource, then you're good to go. With this, now we can, in our XAML file, set this as part of the resources. So in the resource dictionary for the content page, I can, just like I have my VM, define a style sheet. And the style sheet is going to have a source. Now to set the source, I would simply need to write the path of my CSS file relative to my XAML or relative to the root of my project if it starts with a /. So if I start like this, it's relative to my project, which means that I just have to write the name of the folder, which is style sheets, / and the name of the file, which is styles.css. And now I have access to this styles CSS file that I'm going to be defining. If you do see that the preview shows you an exception that this has to be URI relative to your XAML file, because I am inside of another folder, I can simply get out of this folder and then access the style sheets. This shouldn't be necessary. If we start with a /, it should understand that it is relative to the root of the project, but apparently in this case, I do need to specify this. Now, let's start working with the CSS. I am by no means an expert on CSS, but what I want to show you is how it can now work along with your XAML files. So, for example, let's say that we want to change this list views margin. Of course, we can always set this in the list view. You can still do whatever you're familiar with XAML. But over here on the style sheet, now that it is set as an embedded resource and that we have added it to the resources for this content page, we can set that the list view, and this is case insensitive, so I don't need to write with a capital L and a capital V, but I can set the list view and set that the margin is going to be 20. And notice that as soon as I set it over here on the XAML file, that margin is created. So now I have these styles over here on a CSS file, and they are being applied over in a XAML file. And again, all I had to do is set the CSS file to be an embedded resource and point to it inside of the resources for at least this content page by creating a new style sheet resource. So let's keep toying with this CSS file for a bit. Here I am selecting one of the elements by its type, but I could also define them by the base class. So for that, all I have to do is graded like this. So let's say that I want for all of the labels to have a certain color. So all I have to do is grad color, colon, and I can just select any of the elements that appear in here. Let's say that I want some blue violet. Semicolon, go over to the SAML file, and we see all of the labels change their color to this particular color that we set for all of the labels, or all of the elements which base class is a label. And of course, you can always not just set a style that will apply to all of the elements that you have. One of the most used scenarios is in which you have many different styles that apply to a single type. Let's say that a label, and you want some labels to have some style and some labels to have another one. So let's say, and let me inside of this content define a stack layout, that I am going to have more than one style of label. And let me just get this list view inside of the stack layout as well. So I will have, let's say that a label that is going to be title, and all of these other labels that are just normal labels. So at the beginning of this stack layout above the list view, I am going to have a title that is going to say categories. And of course, by default, this is going to have the same style as the one that I'm setting for all of the labels. But let's say that I want to define a style for the titles. I am going to set over here on the CSS file title label style. And this title label is going to have, let's say that first is going to have a font size of 20. Let's say 25, so it's bigger. Or in fact, we can use larger, which is a value that is available there in that enumerable. I will also set the font style to be bold. And because I see these categories label with no margin at all, let me actually set some margin. And the margin, let's set it to 20 to all the sides except to the bottom. And by default, this is not applied to anything. Because I am defining this to be a class, I would have to establish the style class for the label. So I would have to write something additional in the labels that need this style. And this is how you can start to apply different styles to different elements. So this label that is going to be the label for the title will have to establish a style ID of a title label. As soon as I set this style class, and actually I have this exception. Okay, it seems that apparently we cannot set this to larger. Let me set it to 25. And as soon as I apply this style class, it will now identify it as an element that has to apply that class that is defined in the CSS file as the style. And we can see it immediately here in the preview. And by the way, you can see that the blue-violet color is still applied because this is something that is applied to all labels, all elements that have a base class of label. And this is still a label. It is only having an additional styling. And we, of course, could create many different styles in here. Let's say that we're going to create the normal label. And so this normal label is going to have a font size of 20. And we could override the color. So for this, the color is going to be simply black. So we could override it, even though the color is being defined in a higher level. Let's say this is the class level. We can define the style, which would override anything that is coming from that class. So let's say that these labels are going to be normal labels. And so the style class is going to be normal label. And you can see how the color is being overridden. This is no longer the blue-violet. This is now the black, because it is defined at a more specific label. The title label, because it is not overriding the color, it's still getting the color from a more general definition. In this case, the definition of all of those elements that have a base class of label over here when we set the color. So there you have it. This is, of course, a very quick example of how you can now apply style sheets from a CSS into your SAML files. The only thing really that you have to do is set those CSS files to be embedded resources over in your solution. And once those are embedded resources, you can and you have to set them as styles inside of the resources for the element that you're going to be using. In this case, we did this in the content page. I'm sure if any of you is an expert with CSS or has more experience with web development, will be able to do some very interesting things in here. So I'd be happy to hear about what you're implementing here. So if you feel like doing so, please do share some of the styles that you create, maybe some screenshots of what you are applying, the style that you have created in a CSS file and how it looks in a SAML over in the discussions. I am sure that it will serve as inspiration for other students. Now, finally, in the next lecture, before jumping on to another section, we're going to take a look at something else that is also new in Xamarin 3.0 that I think you're going to find very interesting.